You are standing in the scorching heat of the Egyptian desert, watching in horror as workers seal the final stone blocks of a magnificent tomb. But this isn't just any burial ceremony. Inside that tomb, behind those massive limestone blocks being mortared shut forever, a living woman is screaming. Her cries echo off the painted walls depicting scenes of eternal paradise, but for her, this tomb will become an eternal hell. She is Queen Ankhesenamun, and she has just been buried alive by the man who was supposed to protect her, her own husband, the Pharaoh. The workers finish their grim task and step back, their faces grim with the knowledge of what they've just done. The screaming from inside grows fainter, then stops altogether, not because she's found peace, but because the air is running out. You've just witnessed one of the most horrific acts of royal cruelty in human history, where absolute power corrupted so completely that a king could sentence his own wife to the most agonizing death imaginable. This isn't a tale from mythology or legend. This actually happened in ancient Egypt, where the line between divine authority and human monstrosity became so blurred that even the most sacred bonds could be shattered by paranoia, jealousy, and unbridled power. What you're about to hear will challenge everything you thought you knew about ancient Egyptian civilization and reveal the dark reality behind the golden masks and magnificent monuments. Before diving into this forgotten story of survival and suffering, if you enjoyed learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. Please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The pharaoh responsible for this unthinkable act was Amenhotep IV, though history knows him by another name, one that would become synonymous with religious revolution and royal madness. But to understand why a king would bury his own queen alive, we must first understand the world that created such monsters and the woman who would become their victim. Ancient Egypt was a civilization built on the backs of millions, where the pharaoh was considered a living god whose word was literally law. There were no checks on his power, no courts to appeal to, no higher authority than his divine will. When you hold that kind of absolute authority over millions of people, when your slightest whim can mean life or death for entire cities, something fundamental breaks inside the human psyche. Power doesn't just corrupt, it transforms people into creatures that no longer recognize the humanity of others. Ankhesenamun was born into this world of absolute power, but also absolute vulnerability. As a princess of the royal bloodline, she was simultaneously one of the most privileged and most endangered people in Egypt. Royal women were valuable commodities, breeding stock for producing heirs, political pawns for cementing alliances, and ultimately disposable assets when they outlived their usefulness. From the moment of her birth, Ankhesenamun's fate was never truly her own. She would be married to whoever served the political interests of the royal family, bear children to continue the divine bloodline, and live every moment of her life under the watchful eyes of those who saw her not as a person, but as a walking womb wrapped in silk and gold. But Ankhesenamun was different from the typical royal wife. Palace records describe her as intelligent, strong-willed, and unafraid to voice her opinions, even when they contradicted those of her husband. In a world where royal women were expected to be beautiful, silent, and perpetually pregnant, she dared to be an individual with her own thoughts and desires. This independence would prove to be both her greatest strength and her fatal flaw. In the twisted psychology of absolute power, any sign of independent thinking from those who are supposed to be completely subservient becomes a threat that must be eliminated. Ankhesenamun's intelligence and spirit, which might have been celebrated in a different time and place, marked her for destruction in the paranoid world of the Egyptian court. The pharaoh she married was already showing signs of the madness that would eventually consume him. Early in his reign, he had shocked the Egyptian establishment by abandoning the traditional gods that had sustained the kingdom for over 1,000 years. Instead, he declared that only one god would be worshipped, Aten, the sun disk, and that he alone was this god's representative on earth. This wasn't just religious reform. It was the act of a megalomaniac who could no longer tolerate sharing divine authority with anyone or anything else. The traditional priesthood, which had accumulated enormous wealth and influence over the centuries, suddenly found themselves declared heretics. Temples were closed, sacred statues were destroyed, and anyone who refused to accept the new religious order faced imprisonment or death. The pharaoh moved his entire court to a new capital city built in the middle of the desert, far from the traditional centers of power. This wasn't just a change of scenery, it was a deliberate attempt to isolate his followers from outside influences and create a controlled environment where his word was the only reality that mattered. Ankhesenamun found herself trapped in this desert prison, surrounded by sycophants and religious fanatics who competed to demonstrate their devotion to the pharaoh's revolutionary vision. The palace became a bizarre theater where courtiers performed elaborate rituals of worship, directed not just at the sun god, but at the pharaoh himself. But behind the facade of religious devotion and artistic innovation, something darker was taking root. The pharaoh's isolation from traditional advisors and his rejection of established customs had created a feedback loop of increasingly erratic behavior. Without the moderating influence of priests, generals, and court officials who might dare to question his decisions, he began to lose touch with reality itself. Palace servants whispered about his strange nocturnal wanderings, his conversations with invisible entities, and his growing paranoia about plots and conspiracies. He became convinced that enemies were everywhere, in the kitchens preparing his food, among the guards protecting his chambers, even in his own family. This paranoia focused particularly intensely on the women closest to him. In the pharaoh's deteriorating mind, the wives and daughters who shared his bloodline became the most dangerous threats of all. They knew his weaknesses, had access to his private chambers, and possessed the royal bloodline that could legitimize a rival's claim to the throne. Ankhesenamun watched her husband's transformation with growing horror and fear. The man she had married, whatever his flaws, had at least been recognizably human. What he was becoming defied description, a creature of pure ego and paranoia wrapped in the trappings of divine authority. She began to realize that her very existence had become a threat to his increasingly fragile sense of security. As his queen, she possessed knowledge about palace intrigues, access to potential conspirators, and the ability to influence court opinion. More dangerously, she had begun to question not just his policies, but his sanity. The first signs of her husband's deadly intentions came in small changes to palace protocol. Her personal guards were replaced with men whose loyalty was unquestionably devoted to the pharaoh alone. Her correspondence was monitored, her movements restricted, and her access to other members of the royal family severely limited. Ankhesenamun understood that she was being isolated, cut off from anyone who might protect her or help her escape whatever fate her husband was planning. But she also knew that any attempt to flee would be seen as confirmation of his paranoid suspicions, and would likely result in immediate execution. She found herself trapped in a nightmare of her own making, where her intelligence and independence, the very qualities that had once made her attractive to the pharaoh, now marked her as a threat that needed to be eliminated. Every conversation with her husband became a careful dance around his delusions, where a wrong word or expression could trigger violent rage. The palace staff began to avoid her, understanding instinctively that association with the queen had become dangerous. Servants who had once competed for the honor of serving her now found excuses to avoid her chambers. Even her own ladies-in-waiting grew nervous and distant, afraid that their loyalty to her would be seen as disloyalty to the pharaoh. As the months passed, Ankhesenamun realized she was living on borrowed time. Her husband's paranoid episodes were becoming more frequent and more severe. He had already ordered the execution of several court officials on charges of treason that existed only in his imagination. It was only a matter of time before his suspicions turned fully toward her. The queen began making desperate preparations for what she suspected would be her final days. She wrote letters to family members, though she knew they would likely never be delivered. She gave away precious possessions to servants who had remained loyal, understanding that these gifts might be the only inheritance she could leave behind. Most importantly, she tried to document what was happening in the palace. The madness she was witnessing, the innocent people being destroyed by her husband's paranoia, and the systematic dismantling of everything that had made Egyptian civilization great. She hoped that someday someone would find these records and understand the truth about what had happened during these dark years. But even as she prepared for the worst, Ankhesenamun couldn't have imagined the specific horror that her husband was planning for her. In his twisted mind, simply having her executed wouldn't be sufficient punishment for her perceived betrayal. He wanted her to suffer as he believed she had made him suffer, slowly, helplessly, and in complete isolation from anyone who might offer comfort or aid. The pharaoh had decided that his wife would be buried alive. The preparations for Ankhesenamun's living burial began in secret, hidden from even the most trusted palace officials. The pharaoh's madness had reached such depths that he convinced himself this horrific act was not just justified, but divinely ordained. In his fractured mind, burying his wife alive would serve as both punishment for her imagined betrayals and a demonstration to the gods of his absolute devotion to divine justice. He summoned his most loyal architect, a man named Senenmut, who had overseen the construction of several royal tombs. The pharaoh's instructions were delivered in the same calm tone he might use to discuss the weather. He wanted a special chamber constructed, one designed not for the peaceful rest of the dead but for the prolonged suffering of the living. The chamber would need to be soundproof, he explained, to prevent the queen's cries from disturbing the sacred atmosphere of the tomb complex. It should have enough air to sustain life for several hours, but not enough for survival. Most chillingly, it should include small viewing holes that would allow the pharaoh to observe his wife's final moments, to watch as she realized the full horror of her situation and slowly succumbed to suffocation. Senenmut listened to these instructions with growing revulsion, but he knew that refusing would mean his own death. The architect had witnessed what happened to those who defied the pharaoh's commands, no matter how insane they might be. He nodded respectfully and promised that the chamber would be ready within the month. As construction began on what would become Ankhesenamun's tomb, the pharaoh's behavior toward his wife underwent a disturbing transformation. Gone were the suspicious glances and paranoid accusations. Instead, he became almost tender with her, speaking softly and bringing her gifts of jewelry and fine clothing. This sudden kindness was more terrifying than his previous hostility because Ankhesenamun recognized it for what it was, the false compassion of an executioner trying to calm his victim before the final blow. The queen understood that her husband's newfound gentleness meant her fate had been sealed. Whatever he was planning, the decision had already been made, and he could afford to be kind because he knew she posed no further threat to him. This realization filled her with a cold dread that no amount of silk robes or precious ornaments could warm. She began to notice other ominous changes in the palace routine. Workers appeared at odd hours, carrying stone blocks and construction materials toward a section of the royal necropolis that had previously been unused. Guards were positioned at new locations, creating barriers that prevented anyone from observing what was happening in that area. Most tellingly, preparations began for what palace officials described as a special ceremony, one that would demonstrate the pharaoh's commitment to divine justice. Ankhesenamun tried desperately to discover what fate awaited her, but the conspiracy of silence surrounding her husband's plans was complete. Servants who had once gossiped freely now spoke in whispers and fell silent whenever she approached. Even her most trusted ladies-in-waiting claimed ignorance about the mysterious construction project and the upcoming ceremony. The isolation was psychological torture in itself. Surrounded by people who knew exactly what was going to happen to her, but refused to offer even a word of warning or comfort, Ankhesenamun felt like she was already dead, a ghost haunting her own life while everyone around her pretended she still existed. As the construction neared completion, the pharaoh's excited anticipation became increasingly obvious. He would disappear for hours at a time, presumably inspecting the progress of his secret project. When he returned, his eyes held a gleam of satisfaction that made Ankhesenamun's blood run cold. Whatever he was planning brought him genuine pleasure, the kind of joy that only comes from anticipating another person's ultimate suffering. The night before the ceremony, Ankhesenamun barely slept. She lay in her bed listening to the sounds of the palace around her. Footsteps in corridors, whispered conversations, the distant clatter of preparations being made for what everyone except her knew would be her execution. The familiar sounds that had once provided comfort now felt like a countdown to her doom. When morning came, servants arrived to prepare her with unusual care. They bathed her in perfumed water, dressed her in the finest burial garments, and adorned her with jewelry fit for a goddess. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was being prepared for her own funeral while still breathing. Every piece of finery they placed on her body was another weight dragging her toward the grave. The pharaoh appeared as the preparations were being completed, and his satisfaction with her appearance was evident. He nodded approvingly at the servant's work, as if he were inspecting a sacrifice being prepared for the gods. When he looked at his wife, there was no trace of the man she had once known, only the cold calculation of a predator admiring his trapped prey. He explained that she would be participating in a special religious ceremony, one that would demonstrate her devotion to the new order he had established. She would be sealed in a sacred chamber where she could commune directly with the gods and receive divine visions. It would be, he assured her, the greatest honor any queen had ever received. Ankhesenamun listened to these lies with the numbness that comes from accepting the inevitable. She understood now what was going to happen to her, and she knew that no amount of pleading or reasoning would change her husband's mind. The man who had once claimed to love her had been consumed entirely by his madness, leaving behind only a hollow shell animated by paranoia and cruelty. The procession to the tomb began at sunset, timed to coincide with the daily death and rebirth of the sun god. Ankhesenamun was carried in a golden litter, surrounded by priests chanting hymns and courtiers maintaining the pretense that this was indeed a sacred ceremony rather than an execution. The elaborate pageantry couldn't disguise the horror of what was about to unfold, but it provided a veneer of religious legitimacy that allowed everyone involved to pretend they were participating in something holy rather than something monstrous. As they approached the tomb complex, Ankhesenamun caught sight of the chamber that had been prepared for her. It was smaller than she had expected, barely large enough for a person to stand upright, with walls of smooth limestone that would be impossible to climb or damage. The entrance was narrow, designed to be sealed quickly once she was inside, and she could see the massive stone blocks that would be used to entomb her forever. The reality of her situation hit her with renewed force. This wasn't going to be a quick death. Her husband intended for her to spend her final hours in complete darkness, slowly suffocating while knowing that rescue was impossible. It was a death designed to maximize suffering, to ensure that her last moments would be filled with terror and despair. She thought about trying to run, but the guards surrounding her made escape impossible. She considered refusing to enter the chamber, but she knew they would simply drag her inside by force. Her only remaining choice was how she would face her death, with dignity or with panic, with courage or with despair. As the final preparations were made and the entrance to her tomb yawned before her, like the mouth of some ancient monster, Ankhesenamun made a decision that would define her legacy. She would not give her husband the satisfaction of seeing her break. Whatever horrors awaited her in that stone chamber, she would endure them as a queen, with her head held high and her spirit unbroken, even as her body was destroyed by his twisted need for revenge. The pharaoh approached her for what he knew would be their final conversation. His eyes gleamed with anticipation as he prepared to watch his wife disappear forever into the darkness he had created for her. But what he saw in her face wasn't the fear and submission he had expected. Instead, he found himself looking into the eyes of a woman who had transcended his power over her. Someone who had found a strength that even death could not diminish. The moment had arrived. The pharaoh gestured toward the chamber entrance, his voice carrying the false solemnity of someone who believed his own lies about divine justice. The priests began their final chant, their voices echoing off the limestone walls as torches cast dancing shadows across the hieroglyphs that would soon become Ankhesenamun's only companions in the darkness. What happened next revealed the true depth of the pharaoh's depravity. Rather than allowing his wife to enter the chamber with whatever dignity remained to her, he insisted on personally escorting her inside. This wasn't an act of final tenderness. It was the behavior of a man who wanted to savor every moment of his victim's terror, who needed to see the exact instant when hope died in her eyes. The chamber itself was a masterpiece of calculated cruelty. The walls were covered in beautiful paintings depicting scenes of eternal paradise, gardens where the blessed dead would feast forever, rivers of wine and honey, gods welcoming the righteous into their embrace. These images would be the last things Ankhesenamun would see, mocking her with visions of the afterlife she would never reach because her death was designed to deny her soul the proper journey to the underworld. The pharaoh had even arranged for a small oil lamp to be placed inside the chamber, not out of mercy, but to ensure that his wife would spend her final hours in light rather than immediate darkness. This way, she would be able to see the walls closing in around her, to study every detail of her stone prison, and to watch as the flames slowly consumed the limited oxygen in the sealed space. As they stood together in that tiny chamber surrounded by images of divine paradise that would soon become her hell, the pharaoh finally revealed the full scope of his madness. He explained to his wife that her death was necessary not just for his own peace of mind, but for the spiritual purification of their entire kingdom. In his twisted reasoning, she had become a vessel for evil influences that threatened to corrupt his divine mission. He told her that her suffering would serve as a sacrifice to the sun god, that her slow death would purify the royal bloodline of whatever taint had made her question his authority. Every gasping breath she took in the sealed chamber would be a prayer for forgiveness. Every moment of terror would be penance for her imagined betrayals. Ankhesenamun listened to this delusional justification with the detached fascination of someone observing a complete break with reality. The man speaking to her was no longer recognizably human. He had become something else entirely, a creature that wore the face of her husband, but contained only madness and cruelty where his soul should have been. But even in this moment of ultimate horror, she found a way to strike back at her tormentor. Looking directly into his eyes, she spoke words that would haunt him for whatever remained of his miserable life. She told him that the gods he claimed to serve would not be fooled by his justifications, that they could see the truth behind his religious pretenses. His new god, she said, would reject a worshiper who murdered innocent women and called it divine service. More devastatingly, she prophesied that his reign would end in disaster, that his abandonment of Egypt's traditional ways would bring catastrophe upon the kingdom, and that future generations would remember him not as a divine pharaoh, but as a madman who destroyed everything he touched. His name would be erased from monuments, his capital city would crumble into dust, and his revolutionary religion would die with him. The accuracy of this prediction, spoken by a woman facing her own death, seemed to shake the pharaoh's confidence for a moment. But his madness quickly reasserted itself, and he convinced himself that her words were just the desperate curses of a defeated enemy. He stepped back toward the chamber entrance, preparing to seal her inside forever. The workers had been waiting outside with the massive stone blocks that would entomb the queen. These men, skilled craftsmen who had spent their lives creating monuments to eternal life, now found themselves participating in the creation of an eternal death. They moved with mechanical precision, their faces carefully blank as they began fitting the first stones into place. Ankhesenamun watched these preparations with a strange sense of detachment. The reality of what was happening seemed almost too bizarre to accept, that she, a queen of Egypt, descendant of gods, was being buried alive like a common criminal. The disconnect between her royal status and her horrific fate created a surreal quality that made the entire scene feel like a nightmare from which she might still wake. But the scraping sound of stone against stone was all too real, as was the gradual dimming of light from the entrance as each block was fitted into place. The chamber was becoming smaller with each passing moment, the walls literally closing in as her husband's plan reached its final stage. The pharaoh positioned himself at one of the small viewing holes that had been incorporated into the wall design. Through this tiny opening, he would be able to observe his wife's death throes while remaining safely outside the chamber. The existence of these holes revealed the true depths of his perversion. He didn't just want Ankhesenamun to die, he wanted to watch her suffer every moment of her final hours. As the workers continued their grim task, the sounds from outside grew muffled and distant. The chanting of priests, the scraping of tools, even the whispered instructions of the construction foreman, all seemed to be coming from another world. A world of the living that was rapidly becoming inaccessible to the dying queen. The temperature in the chamber began to rise as the ventilation was cut off. The single oil lamp that provided light also generated heat, and with no way for hot air to escape, the small space quickly became stifling. Ankhesenamun could feel sweat beginning to bead on her forehead, despite the cool evening air that had existed moments before outside the tomb. She realized that her husband had planned even this detail, that her death would be as uncomfortable as possible, combining suffocation with heat exhaustion to maximize her suffering. Every aspect of the chamber had been designed with her torment in mind, from the lack of ventilation to the mocking images of paradise painted on walls she could never escape. The sound of the workers grew fainter as more stones were fitted into place. Soon, only a small gap remained at the top of the entrance, just enough space for the pharaoh to continue observing her through his viewing hole, but not enough for any meaningful amount of air to circulate. The chamber was becoming a sealed box, and she was the living contents being packaged for delivery to whatever afterlife awaited those who died in such unnatural circumstances. In these final moments before complete entombment, Ankhesenamun made a decision that would define how she spent her remaining time. Rather than giving in to panic or despair, she chose to use her last hours to preserve some record of what had happened to her. Using a piece of jewelry that contained a sharp edge, she began scratching words into the soft limestone walls. Her message was simple but devastating, a record of her husband's madness, his abandonment of traditional Egyptian values, and his transformation from a king into a monster. She carved her own name and the date of her murder, ensuring that future archaeologists who might discover the chamber would understand that she had been buried alive by the pharaoh himself. More importantly, she used her final words to curse her husband and his revolutionary religion. Drawing on the ancient formulas that every royal child learned, she called upon the traditional gods of Egypt to witness her murder and to exact appropriate revenge upon the man who had committed it. These weren't empty threats. In Egyptian belief, the words of a dying person carried special power, and the curse of a murdered queen would be particularly potent. The pharaoh, watching through his viewing hole, could see her scratching at the walls, but couldn't make out what she was writing. His excitement at observing her death was tinged with nervousness about what message she might be leaving behind. But it was too late to stop her. The chamber was nearly sealed, and opening it again would ruin the carefully planned execution. As the final stone was fitted into place, the last sliver of outside light disappeared, leaving Ankhesenamun alone with the flickering flame of her oil lamp. The sudden silence was overwhelming. No more sounds of construction, no more chanting from priests, no more evidence that a world of living people existed beyond her stone prison. The psychological impact of this complete isolation was immediate and devastating. Human beings are not designed to exist in such perfect solitude, and the knowledge that she was utterly alone began to affect her mind even before the physical effects of suffocation set in. The chamber felt like it was shrinking around her, the painted walls seeming to press closer with each passing moment. But Ankhesenamun had prepared herself mentally for this ordeal, and she refused to let panic consume her remaining time. Instead, she began to recite the ancient prayers that would help her soul navigate the journey to the afterlife. Assuming her unnatural death didn't prevent that journey entirely, her voice speaking words of power into the silence became her only companion in the darkness. Outside the sealed chamber, the pharaoh dismissed the workers and priests, wanting to observe his wife's final moments in private. What he expected to see through his viewing hole was a woman gradually succumbing to terror and suffocation, providing him with the satisfaction of complete victory over someone who had dared to question his authority. But what he actually observed was something that shook him to his core. A queen facing death with dignity and courage that made his own cowardice and cruelty seem even more pathetic by comparison. Instead of breaking under the horror of her situation, Ankhesenamun had transcended it, finding strength in the very traditions and beliefs that he had tried to destroy. The oil lamp's flame began to flicker more weakly as the oxygen in the sealed chamber was gradually consumed. Ankhesenamun could feel the air becoming thicker, harder to breathe, but she continued her prayers with steady determination. Each word she spoke was an act of defiance against the man who had tried to break her spirit along with her body. Through his viewing hole, the pharaoh watched with growing unease as his wife maintained her composure in circumstances that should have driven her to madness. He had expected screaming, clawing at the walls, desperate pleas for mercy that would never come. Instead, he witnessed something that challenged his entire worldview. a demonstration of spiritual strength that his own twisted soul could never comprehend. As the hours passed, the chamber grew hotter and more stifling. The limestone walls began to sweat with condensation from Ankhesenamun's breathing, and the beautiful painted scenes of paradise started to blur as moisture ran down their surfaces. The irony wasn't lost on her. Even the images of eternal bliss were weeping for what was happening in this place. Her breathing became more labored as the available oxygen decreased, but her mind remained clear. She thought about her childhood, about the woman she might have become if she had been born into a different world, about the children she would never have, and the life she would never live. But rather than filling her with despair, these thoughts brought a strange kind of peace. The pharaoh's excitement at watching her slow death was beginning to curdle into something else entirely. He had expected this experience to provide him with a sense of closure, to prove definitively that he held absolute power over everyone in his kingdom. Instead, he found himself confronted with evidence of a strength that his power could destroy but never truly defeat. Ankhesenamun's lips began to move more slowly as the lack of oxygen affected her coordination, but she never stopped her recitations. The ancient words of power seemed to take on a life of their own in the sealed chamber, echoing off the walls and creating harmonics that made the pharaoh shiver with inexplicable dread. It was as if the gods themselves were speaking through his dying wife, using her voice to pronounce judgment on his crimes. The oil lamp guttered and went out, plunging the chamber into complete darkness. Now Ankhesenamun existed in a world without sight, where only touch and sound remained to connect her to reality. She could feel the smooth walls around her, still warm from the heat generated by her own body, and hear the sound of her increasingly desperate breathing as her lungs struggled to extract what little oxygen remained. But even in this absolute darkness, she found ways to resist her husband's attempt to destroy her completely. Her fingers continued to trace patterns on the walls, not just the words she had carved earlier, but ritual symbols that would help guide her soul to the afterlife despite the unnatural circumstances of her death. Each symbol was both a prayer and a promise that her spirit would survive to witness her husband's eventual downfall. The pharaoh could no longer see what was happening inside the chamber, but he could hear the gradually weakening sounds of movement and breathing. What had begun as his moment of ultimate triumph was becoming something else entirely. A vigil beside the deathbed of the only person who had ever truly known him. Watching as that knowledge died with her, hours passed in this macabre observation. The pharaoh found himself unable to leave his viewing post, compelled to witness every moment of the slow murder he had orchestrated. But instead of satisfaction, he felt a growing sense of unease that he couldn't identify or explain. Something was wrong with this scene, though he couldn't articulate what it was. Inside the chamber, Ankhesenamun's consciousness began to drift as carbon dioxide poisoning affected her brain. But rather than the confused delirium that typically accompanied suffocation, her mind seemed to expand and clarify. The darkness around her no longer felt oppressive. Instead, it felt like a doorway opening onto something vast and unknowable. She began to see things that shouldn't have been visible in the sealed chamber. Figures from Egypt's past seemed to materialize in the darkness. Previous queens who had suffered under the madness of absolute power. Priests who had died defending the old gods. Common people whose lives had been crushed beneath the weight of royal excess. They weren't frightening apparitions, but welcoming presences, extending their hands to guide her toward whatever lay beyond death. The pharaoh, still watching through his peephole, noticed that the sounds from inside the chamber had changed. Instead of the increasingly desperate breathing he expected, he heard something that chilled his blood. Soft laughter, as if his dying wife had found something amusing in her final moments. The sound was completely unexpected and deeply unsettling, suggesting that whatever was happening inside the chamber was beyond his understanding or control. Ankhesenamun's laughter wasn't born of madness, but of sudden comprehension. She understood now that her husband's attempt to destroy her had actually freed her from the prison of royal life that had confined her since birth. In trying to bury her alive, he had inadvertently given her the opportunity to die as herself, rather than as the role she had been forced to play. The realization brought her a peace that seemed impossible under the circumstances. She was no longer Queen Ankhesenamun, political pawn, and royal breeding stock. She was simply a woman facing death with courage, surrounded by the spirits of others who had walked this path before her. The pharaoh's power over her was ending, and soon she would exist in a realm where his authority meant nothing. Her breathing became shallower and more irregular as the final stages of suffocation began. But instead of fighting against the inevitable, she embraced it as a release from a world that had never allowed her to be fully human. Each breath brought her closer to a freedom that no pharaoh could grant or deny. Outside the chamber, her husband experienced something he had never felt before: genuine fear. Not the political anxiety that came with threats to his throne, but existential terror at the thought of what he had become and what he was doing. The woman dying in the chamber had been the only person in his life who had seen him as something other than a god king, and her death would leave him truly alone with his madness. The sounds from inside the chamber grew fainter and more irregular. Ankhesenamun's movements became sporadic, her breathing barely audible even to someone listening intently. The pharaoh realized he was witnessing the exact moment when a human soul left its body, something that should have been sacred, but which he had turned into an act of ultimate profanity. As the night wore on, the chamber fell silent. The woman who had entered it as a living, breathing human being was now nothing more than a corpse, sealed inside a stone box. The pharaoh had achieved his goal of eliminating someone he saw as a threat, but the victory felt hollow and strange. Instead of triumph, he felt an emptiness that seemed to echo through his entire being. He remained at his viewing post long after the sounds had stopped, unable to accept that the execution he had planned so carefully was actually complete. Part of him kept expecting to hear movement or breathing that would indicate his wife had somehow survived the impossible conditions inside the chamber. But the silence stretched on, broken only by the distant sounds of the desert wind and the settling of stones in the cooling night air. When dawn finally came, the pharaoh was forced to confront the reality of what he had done. The chamber contained not a living enemy who might threaten his reign, but the corpse of a woman who had once loved him, who had shared his bed and his hopes for the future. The transformation from person to problem to corpse was complete, but it had changed him in ways he was only beginning to understand. The immediate aftermath of Ankhesenamun's murder revealed the true scope of the pharaoh's isolation. The courtiers who had participated in the execution avoided his presence, unable to meet his eyes or speak to him normally. Even his most loyal supporters seemed shaken by what they had witnessed, and whispers began to circulate about whether their king had finally crossed a line from which there was no return. The pharaoh himself seemed different, more erratic, more paranoid, more disconnected from the reality around him. Having murdered the person who knew him best, he found himself surrounded by people who saw him only as a source of power or terror. The loneliness that followed was more complete than anything he had experienced before, an isolation that no amount of royal authority could fill. But the most disturbing change was in his relationship with death itself. Having orchestrated such an elaborate and personal killing, the pharaoh became obsessed with the mechanics of dying. He would spend hours discussing with his physicians the exact process by which life left the body, the sensations experienced during suffocation, and the spiritual implications of unnatural death. This obsession began to affect his decision-making in ways that alarmed even his most devoted followers. He started ordering executions not just for political reasons, but to observe the dying process, treating condemned prisoners like subjects in some twisted experiment. The palace became a place where death was not just common, but celebrated, where the ending of human life became a form of entertainment for a king who had lost all connection to his own humanity. The workers who had sealed Ankhesenamun's tomb were sworn to secrecy about what they had done, but secrets have a way of spreading in closed communities. Within months, rumors were circulating throughout Egypt about the pharaoh who had buried his own wife alive. These stories, growing more elaborate with each telling, began to undermine his authority in ways that no military defeat or economic crisis could have achieved. The traditional priests, already opposed to his religious reforms, seized upon these rumors as evidence that the pharaoh had been corrupted by evil forces. They began secretly teaching that his abandonment of the old gods had opened him to demonic influence, and that his increasingly erratic behavior was proof that he was no longer fit to rule as a divine king. Even more damaging were the whispers among the common people, who had initially supported the pharaoh's reforms as a challenge to the established religious hierarchy. The story of a king who would murder his own wife suggested a level of cruelty that even the most oppressed peasant found shocking. The man they had seen as a reformer was revealed as something far worse than the corrupt priest he had replaced. The psychological impact on the pharaoh himself was becoming impossible to hide. Palace servants reported finding him talking to empty rooms, as if carrying on conversations with invisible companions. Some claimed to have heard him speaking in his wife's voice, as if she were somehow present and responding to his words. Whether this was genuine madness or an elaborate performance designed to avoid responsibility for his actions, it created an atmosphere of supernatural dread throughout the court. The sealed chamber containing Ankhesenamun's remains became a focal point for the pharaoh's deteriorating mental state. He would visit the tomb complex at all hours, sometimes spending entire nights sitting beside the wall that separated him from his wife's corpse. Guards reported that he would press his ear against the stone, listening for sounds that could never come, and that he often wept with a grief that seemed incompatible with his earlier satisfaction at her death. These nocturnal vigils revealed the true complexity of the pharaoh's psychological condition. The same man who had coldly planned and executed his wife's murder was now tormented by guilt and longing that he couldn't acknowledge or resolve. The chamber that was supposed to end his problems had instead become the source of new and more terrible forms of suffering. But perhaps most disturbing of all was the way the pharaoh began to rewrite the history of what had happened. In his official pronouncements, Ankhesenamun had died of natural causes and been given a burial befitting her royal status. He commissioned artists to create images of her peaceful death and glorious afterlife, as if beautiful lies could somehow erase the ugly truth of what he had done. This revisionist project extended to the chamber itself, which he ordered sealed behind additional walls and hidden passages, designed to prevent its eventual discovery. The pharaoh seemed to believe that if he could make the physical evidence disappear, the crime itself would somehow be undone. But the truth has a way of surviving even the most determined efforts to bury it, and Ankhesenamun's story would eventually emerge to haunt not just her husband, but the entire civilization that had allowed such horrors to occur. As news of the queen's mysterious death spread beyond Egypt's borders, foreign diplomats began reporting back to their own rulers about the instability of the pharaoh's regime. The murder of a royal wife, whatever the official explanations, suggested a level of internal chaos that made Egypt an unreliable ally and a potentially vulnerable target for military aggression. The pharaoh's isolation became complete as even his family members began to distance themselves from his increasingly erratic behavior. Brothers who had once competed for his favor now avoided the palace entirely, and even his own children seemed frightened by their father's transformation. The man who had once commanded the loyalty of millions found himself ruling over a kingdom held together only by fear and tradition. But the most profound change was in the pharaoh's relationship with his own mortality. Having witnessed his wife's slow death in such intimate detail, he became obsessed with his own eventual demise. He began planning elaborate tombs and burial procedures as if preparing for death could somehow protect him from the judgment he knew awaited him in the afterlife. The irony of this obsession wasn't lost on those who observed it. The man who had denied his wife a proper burial now spent most of his time preparing for his own funeral. It was as if he understood on some unconscious level that his crimes would follow him beyond death and that no amount of preparation could save him from whatever punishment awaited in the world to come.